Thank you, especially to Avner for inviting me to this conference. I am very honored, and I have been very impressed and heartened by all the very informative presentations this morning. When I first started working on coal ash in 2000, 16 years ago, you couldn't get 6 people in a room to talk about coal ash. If you did, probably 5 of them would fall asleep. You couldn't get funding to work on the issue. The expertise and the intelligence of both the researchers and the advocacy groups like SELC and Waterkeepers that keep this issue going and keep it on the front page is transformative. So I really appreciate all the work of the people in this room. Now, I want to step back a bit on this issue and look at not what's happening here so much in North Carolina, but what is happening on the national level, the risk posed nationally by coal ash, as well as the reaction of the federal government to that threat, the strengths and weaknesses of the new coal ash rule that was just passed or just put into law last year, and also, what the role is, continuing role of people like us who care about coal ash pollution. Okay. So I won't dwell a lot about the scale because there's been a lot of good slides that have already shown people where the coal ash ponds are. But just to reiterate the incredible volume of the waste that we produce every year in the United States, 130 million tons, enough to fill train cars from the North Pole to the South Pole. That doesn't account for all the waste that's been produced by power plants over the course of decades. Industries predicts it's about 3 billion pounds that has been buried throughout the United States. Someone has already mentioned it's the second largest industrial waste stream, second only to mining waste. And mining waste contains a whole lot of earth and rocks, and so it is not really comparable. We know there are more than 1,500 mostly unlined and unmonitored landfills and ponds, as well as hundreds of minefills throughout the United States. Again, this is what we know. When you deal with the waste that was first started to be regulated on the federal level last year, there's a lot that we don't know about it. There's a lot that's buried in quarries. You saw that spill in Wisconsin. We Energies didn't know, even claimed not to even know it was there. It's put in the ground, it's paved over, people walk away from it. But unfortunately, these deposits do leach and they do tend to be unstable. So this is a variant of the slide that you've seen before, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But I will point out the hotspot that we are in right now with the high hazard dams around Raleigh. There are 331 high and significant hazard coal ash dams. This is only a portion of the 952 dams across the U.S. But you will see the concentration, as you do on this slide, of the dams in the Southeast, Appalachia, and the Illinois Basin. This slide shows you the contaminated sites, pretty much tracking where we've seen the coal ash dams, the Southeast, Appalachia, Midwest. I do want to point out something because it relates directly to what EPA, the need for EPA's rule, is that if you look around where I grew up, around Milwaukee and in Wisconsin, you'll see a lot of dots. There isn't a lot of coal burned in Wisconsin relative to other states. So why, at one point, would there be more damage case, more contaminated water cases in Wisconsin than any other state? The reason is because Wisconsin, for some reason, had more strict coal ash regulations and actually required monitoring. So historically, where monitoring was required, and understand that before the federal rule, there were some states that didn't regulate coal ash at all. But where monitoring is done, pollution is found and contamination is found. So in a state like Wisconsin, which did this early in the 70s, they racked up numerous damage cases. This just shows when you put the maps together, you start to look like the Verizon network. You know, note again, this does not include landfills, minefills, or any of the other various holes in the ground, or the sites that we will discover to be contaminated after groundwater monitoring is made public. So let's get to how that information is going to be made public and what the EPA has done. So the first ever EPA rule came about as a result of the disaster in Kingston. After the disaster in Kingston, the administrator, Lisa Jackson, she hadn't even stepped into her office yet. In her confirmation hearing, this was the disaster she had to confront. So she promised Barbara Boxer there would be coal ash regulations. Fast forward about 3 years, tremendous political pressure on this issue by the utilities, specifically by Duke Energy, which is one of the, we know it from the records of what they spend and who they went to talk to in the administration, one of the prime lobbyists against a national coal ash rule. Because there is no, in answer to the very good question, there's no question that Duke knows exactly what's going on at its sites. Utility companies have known for decades that coal ash leaches harmful heavy metals into groundwater and that their effluents are contaminating surface water. So this is, you know, this is not a surprise, but it's become now in the public consciousness, and so, you know, perhaps the public or communities are surprised, but the utilities always knew it. Anyway, it was very difficult to get a rule out of EPA. Earthjustice had to sue them. We finally got a court-ordered deadline, and we finally got a rule. Was it the rule we wanted? Absolutely not. It was a huge disappointment. So, should I admit that I cried when I saw it? It would be true. But it represents a huge step forward. But the problem was they regulated coal ash as a non-hazardous waste. They put it in a box in the federal under RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. They put it in a box where there can only be self-implementing regulations. What that means is that the states are not required to enforce the law. They don't have to run permit programs. They can totally ignore the law if they want. The federal government, EPA, has no authority to enforce it. It can't enforce it. So we're left with citizens, should they have the know-how, the resources, the data, they can bring citizen suits to enforce the law. Now, the strengths and weaknesses. Again, even though it wasn't the rule we wanted, there was nothing before it. There were no federal regulations applying to coal ash. So now we have a rule that establishes standards for the construction, operation, maintenance, cleanup, and closure of coal ash ponds and landfills. So we've got a baseline from which the states, if they choose, can enact stronger regulations, or if they don't choose to, the utilities have to abide by these rules. How will this be enforced if the states don't get involved? What they've done, what EPA has done, it's a new 21st century experiment in rulemaking, is it's done through transparency. And this is going to be very important to those of you that aren't lawyers and who are in the research area and scientists, because it talks to the availability of information and data on every coal ash pond and landfill in the United States. And the rule has been in effect for a year. Nothing, you haven't heard much about it. You're going to hear a lot about this in the next month. Because what EPA has done is that it's required the compliance to be, each utility's compliance to be posted on a publicly accessible website. Every utility has a website. They're all called the same thing, so they can be more easily found. EPA even has a website where you can go and click on your state and find your utility. And on that website, they have to demonstrate compliance. They have to post inspections. They have to post groundwater monitoring data. So all this will be available to the advocacy community, people who live near the plants, as well as the research community. On the downside, we didn't get the phase out of all coal ash ponds, which was what we were really looking for. There's no reason to store ash in a pond for all the reasons you heard by all the other speakers. It should be disposed of dry, above groundwater in an engineered landfill. Second, the rule doesn't apply to inactive coal ash ponds at sites that have retired. So that leaves a lot of sites abandoned. It doesn't apply to beneficial use, which is another huge loophole in the rule. And it doesn't apply to mine fills, which is the disposal of ash in active and abandoned mines. And perhaps most importantly for the Southeast, it doesn't apply to municipal solid waste landfills that accept coal ash. So all this ash that's being moved, and we want it to be moved, and I applaud SELC for their settlements and their work, but it needs to be moved to a place that's safe to hold it. And a lot of it is going to household waste dumps, municipal solid waste landfills that are not regulated to accept the waste. Now I want to go through it. We don't have much time, but I want to hit the highlights of what's in the federal rule. The requirement to minimize fugitive dust was one of the first requirements that became effective, and this became effective last year. All utilities have to have fugitive dust control plans, and they have to minimize dust during disposal, transportation, storage. The picture you see here was taken on the Moapa Band of Paiutes Reservation, which is directly adjacent to the Reed Gardner Power Plant. Dust is a problem in many places, but especially out in the arid west, where the dust is picked up from the landfills. And you can see in this picture how a dust cloud can actually be formed. We have a video, a nice film about the Moapa on our website, and I invite all of you to go take a look, because it is quite concerning. And we have heard that since the requirement to minimize dust is a federal law, things have gotten a bit better. Next, the landfills and ponds were brought into an operating regime that is pretty much similar to what other landfills are subject to. They have to do weekly inspections, annual inspections, and then very importantly, this 5-year assessment. Let me talk a little bit more about that. The 5-year stability and safety factor assessment is what is due. It was due on the 17th of this month to be completed, and it will be posted November 16th. So November 16th is sort of the operative date for when some very critical information is going to be available for every existing coal ash pond in the United States. It has to identify deficiencies. Deficiencies have to be corrected as soon as feasible. How do we know they're going to be corrected? Again, this is a website, transparency-driven rule. The utility will have to post the fact that they have corrected the deficiency. But one thing that you should look for is that for the first time this October, coal ash ponds, coal ash dams are now subject to the run-of-the-mill dam safety, earth and impoundment regulations that every other dam in the United States has been subject to. So these dams, which were impounding toxic sludge, were not regulated as stringently as those dams holding water or anything else. Now these FEMA requirements are applicable to coal ash dams. There's 4 factors of safety. The dams have to attest to the fact that they've met these factors of safety, and if they don't, they will have to actually cease disposing by April and initiate closure. So an extremely important requirement. Also, in the assessments that have to be posted, again on November 16th, you have to have full construction diagrams, details, so you will know how the dam is constructed, where it's constructed, how much material it has in it for every pond, and this will also have to be posted on the internet. We also have design and operating standards for new and expanded landfills and ponds. When a coal ash pond or a coal ash landfill is now built, there are minimum federal requirements. They deal with location restrictions. Groundwater monitoring systems have to be put in place. They have to be lined. Leachate collection systems have to be installed in landfills. And all of this has to be installed before a teaspoon of ash is put into the new pond or landfill. So we're looking good as far as new construction. Unfortunately, I think a lot of utilities, instead of undergoing the expense of constructing something new, since it is so highly regulated. They are expanding the old impoundments or landfills, and they're also going again to the municipal solid waste landfills. We also, under the rule, have very good location restrictions. Unfortunately, those location restrictions are phased in somewhat slowly, and it isn't till 2018 that we can address the existing ponds and look at those locations restrictions, which include a 5-foot separation from groundwater, which we know, as Nick pointed out, is many, many ponds are not going to be able to comply with. Those ponds will have to be closed in a couple of years. The restriction will be in effect in a couple of years. You can also not have ponds in wetlands, floodplains, fault areas, seismic zones, or unstable areas. So another big category in the new regulations is mandated cleanup following spills and what a company has to do to clean up groundwater after groundwater is determined to be contaminated. They have to immediately, upon a spill, immediately take all necessary measures. There are timeframes for responding to spills. There's public disclosure. There's public meeting requirements. There's a whole set of regulations that looks a bit like a Superfund cleanup for when the next spill occurs. When we find out, or when the utility finds out through monitoring that it's contaminated groundwater, there are strict groundwater cleanup standards that will be applicable across the board to clean up groundwater. And those are, the standard is that they have to be cleaned up to the MCL right at the boundary, not a mile from the boundary, not within a risk zone. They have to be cleaned up right at the boundary of the landfill to the MCL or to background. Closure. The federal rule is weak on closure. Admittedly, this is going to be a real fight with the utilities to make sure that the ponds and landfills that they are closing are closed properly. There's no requirement to move the waste. Again, I applaud SELC and their tremendous ability to get the waste moved into safe areas. EPA only requires that if the waste is left in place, that it doesn't continue to be released to groundwater or surface water. So it'll be up to advocates like Earthjustice to read those closure plans, which will be posted again on November 16th, along with the other documents. And we will have to assess whether there are sites which there certainly are, which are currently sitting in groundwater, where it'll be anathema to simply place a cap, 2-foot soil cap over that impoundment, because you're going to continue to get leaching as the groundwater continues to flow through the underground deposits of waste. Nick talked a little bit about, and there's a good question about the draining of wastewater and sludge that's going to occur with these ponds. That's another thing that advocates at Earthjustice and other organizations are going to have to watch for. If you've got 10 million and more gallons of sludge in a pond and wastewater contaminated with arsenic and selenium, you want to get rid of the pond, but you don't want to do what's been done at a couple of ponds already in North Carolina and Virginia and just simply pump it into the adjacent river. I want to talk about coal ash and civil rights. This has been an important issue in North Carolina and nationally. We were very fortunate in that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights this year, in 2005, decided that it was going to do its enforcement report on coal ash and civil rights. They choose a topic every year. It can span from healthcare to prisons to education. And so the choosing of coal ash was unusual and very fortuitous. I think what attracted their attention are the people in this picture. This represents a couple living in the trailer home that was next to the Arrowhead landfill. Following the spill in Kingston, Tennessee, which was a middle-class white area, actually a very nice riverside community there that was destroyed by the spill, they loaded up the 4 million tons of coal ash that they scooped up from the river. They put it on trains and they took it down to Alabama. to one of the poorest, to the poorest county in Alabama, to one of the poorest communities, 97% African American, and they dumped it in a landfill, literally, a couple hundred feet from these people's homes. It was a disastrous removal effort, and the people in that community, in the Uniontown, Alabama community, are still fighting the aftermath and also fighting the fact that the permit for the landfill allows coal ash from 33 states to continue to roll in and be dumped at the landfill. The Commission on Civil Rights, actually the North Carolina Advisory Committee held a meeting of its own here in North Carolina, and which was an extremely moving meeting. I was present, and it, I think, helped to sway the commissioners to write a very powerful report and to make powerful statements in the press about the importance of protecting civil rights. Among their findings was the percent of minorities and low-income individuals living near coal ash ponds is disproportionately high, that racial minorities and low-income communities are disproportionately affected by the siting of waste disposal and often are ill-equipped to fight that siting. And that, in particular, the EPA rule, by being a rule, as I described before, that's self-implementing, negatively impacts low-income communities because those communities in minority communities, because those communities are likely not to have the tools, to have the resources to bring a suit in federal court to assess complicated technical data, and would be this type of rule, it's particularly disproportionately harmful. Thus, they had many recommendations. I just picked 4. The first was that coal ash should be classified as a special waste. Yes, that's what we said, as well as 50,000 other commenters on the rule. Special waste is a category of hazardous waste. It then would have had full EPA enforcement and full state enforcement. Federal funding should be increased for research on health impacts. EPA should test drinking water and also test the stability of high hazard dams, and also that EPA should provide technical assistance to minority, tribal, and low-income communities to help enforce the coal ash rule. Drilling down just a bit to North Carolina, prior to the North Carolina committee hearing, we did an assessment of where, in fact, are coal ash ponds disproportionately impacting environmental justice communities. We can just take a look at the first line here, looking at Ballew's Creek plant. You've got a 74% non-white and a 1 mile radius, which is double the average of North Carolina or the national average. The income, the percent low income, is far higher than the state and the federal average. And then the percent of the population with less than a high school education in the 1 mile radius is also double both the national and the state average, more than double. And of course, that again would impact perhaps the ability to assess data and to have the resources to launch citizen suits. I mentioned before the dangerous gap in the CCR rule as it applies to municipal solid waste landfills. The Arrowhead landfill that I spoke of before was just such a landfill. It was a municipal solid waste landfill and therefore didn't have some of the protections that are needed that would be applicable at a coal ash landfill. The EPA acknowledges that there are several very important protections that are not present at municipal solid waste landfills, so we have their acknowledgement there in the final rule. Some of these have to do with fugitive dust, groundwater monitoring, waste compatibility, and other problems, important problems that we're hoping that should there be a Clinton administration, Earthjustice will be able to push this issue to get a final rule as it would apply to municipal solid waste landfills. We have petitioned the administration, the Obama administration, already for such a rule. They have not moved on it yet, but I am hopeful that we can get this problem cured. because as we speak, there are millions of tons of coal ash going to these landfills. I did not get deep into groundwater monitoring or deep into the location requirements because groundwater monitoring will not be a requirement at all landfills and ponds until April of 2017. Then it should be a very big deal because all the data, again, will have to be posted on these websites, and I hope that many of the scientists in this room will be able to take advantage of that and take a look at what the utilities are finding around their landfills and around their ponds. And again, every landfill and pond has to be monitored. The locational restrictions will also be incredibly important, particularly from a water protection standpoint, because we then will know what landfills are in contact with groundwater. That will have to be admitted in 2018. Will we be able to target those landfills and use those landfills as places where we're going to concentrate on getting safe closure? So our role, again, I'm just so heartened by the interest in this issue by all of our communities and by the press, and I hope that this continues and that our role in protecting communities and working together can just expand. I would love to see more research into the impacts of coal ash contaminants on public health. I would love especially to see more site-specific assessments. In my travels around the country and in my contact with people, in states from, across the United States and internationally, what we really need is data. What we really need is testing of private wells. The utilities will always try to hide the ball, whether you're in this country or anywhere else. Their hydrogeologic assessments will be silly, non-factual. But unless you bring them to court and unless you have an expert on your side, it's impossible to determine that. But what we can rely on is testing of drinking water wells, by the folks in this room and analyzing that and identifying communities in trouble before people get harmed. Third, in groups like Earthjustice will continue to work to strengthen both state and federal coal ash protections. We are suing, as you may know, we have sued EPA over the federal rule for the weakness of its regulations. Two important, I want to mention one which particularly relates to the work that Duke has been doing, is EPA must have been lobbied very hard to leave boron off the list of contaminants that would drive a cleanup. Like, think of that. Boron is used as a marker for where coal ash contamination occurs. The final rule didn't require boron to drive any cleanup. Boron is also one of the first contaminants that leaves a coal ash site before more toxic contaminants like arsenic and thallium and chromium. So you want to start cleaning up a site when it's got boron in the groundwater. But boron wasn't there. So in our suit against EPA, we raised that issue as being arbitrary and capricious. We already got the agreement of EPA to add boron to the list of contaminants that drive cleanups. And so I think that would be a game changer. And actually, I was at an industry conference, and somebody took me aside and said it was nuclear. So we're very happy about that. We also got monitoring of inactive coal ash ponds, something that was not in the rule before. So we need to continue to fight for better regs, both on the state and national levels. We need to bring litigation on the part of communities who are harmed. And lastly, we need to always keep an eye on the civil rights of those who may be receiving the new ash that's being moved into their communities, and also those communities who are now living next to coal ash ponds, because we know that it predominantly impacts low-income and minority populations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There will be some question, and then we'll have a discussion of all the speakers. But if you have a question to Lisa.
guess so. My question is both for Linda and for Nick Torrey, and they're kind of related. So what Nick mentioned is that some of the material for the coal ash cleanup could be used, recycled into cement. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that, particularly given that there's going to be contaminant, what is that going to do health-wise? And related to that is the fact that in the regulation, beneficial use is not regulated. Would using the coal ash to do cement be considered beneficial use?
Great question. And in fact, I had a couple of slides on beneficial use, but I thought I would go over time if I use them. But maybe since you have an interest, maybe I will show. Can I? But first, let me say, I do want to correct something because I see this all the time. And I was heartened because I think EPA is starting not to use this statistic. The statistic that about 40% of ash is recycled is really, I want to say a nice word for BS. The industry says that's what's recycled. The American Coal Ash Association, which is hand in glove with the utility industry, says about 40% to 50% is recycled. What that includes is structural fill and mine fills. Structural fill can be an extremely dangerous form of reuse of coal ash. It can be put in low-lying areas, in contact with groundwater. It's not monitored, the areas aren't lined. And so to say that's a quote-unquote beneficial use, I think is a real misnomer. Same thing with mine fill. Putting coal ash back into a mine is not putting the coal back where it came from. It's putting now a toxic industrial waste into a fractured environment where it can cause more harm to communities that are already burdened by all the impacts of coal mining. So there's lots of ash that's being used for those two applications. I think it's 12 million tons a year for mine fill and millions of tons for structural fill, and that shouldn't be in the category of recycling. I might punt the concrete question to Nick. It's always been a question in my mind whether the radon is sufficiently bound up in concrete to make it safe for homes. However, when I've asked scientists, and EPA has done its study of concrete made with coal ash, the answer is always it's bound up in a solid substrate, don't worry about it. So it's not, being a lawyer, I don't feel like I can answer that question. I think it's a question that is useful to keep raising. EPA did look at it and determine that there wouldn't be a problem. Just one other thing on concrete, and I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't answer ash questions. I could go on. So another thing about concrete is that what you're substituting for in concrete, when you make concrete from ash, you're using less Portland cement. And Portland cement is really a nasty substance as well. If you look at the metal profile of Portland, the heavy metal profile of Portland cement, you're going to find a lot of the same nasty, toxic metals as you find in coal ash, the arsenic, the mercury, the chromium. And the reason you can substitute one for the other is that they're very similar. So concrete itself is not very benign in its components. So that was another reason why I tend not to overly worry about the use of coal ash in concrete. And thirdly, given all the other things we do with coal ash that can truly injure public health and the environment, binding it up in concrete seems like one of the better solutions. The best solution is not to burn coal and create this in the first place. But if we're going to have to dispose of it or recycle, concrete has been low on my list to be worried about. But I'd be happy to hear from any scientists in the room who might disagree with that.
Yeah, so just a little more on reuse options for coal ash. First of all, you're absolutely right, Lisa, that unlined structural fills are a bad idea. using coal ash for road beds is a bad idea where you just put it down, because all that does is spread the problem around. It's not confined. There are structural fills that are just like a mini modern lined landfill. They're doing that out in Asheville, for example, where they've essentially encapsulated it in the same kinds of liners that you would use in a modern industrial solid waste landfill. Extensive groundwater monitoring, leachate collection, all those kinds of protections. So it can be done right, but it needs to be done right, and if it's not, it's just spreading the problem around. In terms of concrete, we have learned a little bit about this through our work with a couple of utilities. Santee Cooper, the South Carolina utility that I mentioned, was able to put together a deal to actually clean up all of its coal ash sites in South Carolina, 3 different sites, by partnering with a firm called CEFA that has developed a new technology to recycle old coal ash, that is coal ash from these lagoons, for concrete. One thing that's important to remember as we think about safety and stuff, because I think all of us have this intuition that there must be something dangerous about it, is that fly ash, newly generated fly ash, it has been used as an ingredient in concrete for decades. And actually going back, I mean, this is something that Duke Energy recently mentioned in their press release when they were talking about the cleanup at Buck. But it's true that volcanic ash even has been used in concrete going back for millennia. So it makes concrete stronger. So at nuclear plants, for example, you have to use concrete that's made with fly ash because it's actually stronger than other forms. And using concrete that's made from fly ash actually has less net greenhouse gas emissions than conventional concrete manufacturing. What the new process does is it takes old coal ash and reduces the carbon level of the ash to the point where it is the same as modern newly generated fly ash, so that it can be used in concrete. So that's all it does. It essentially reburns it to just lower that carbon content down to the point where it can be used. And then it's the same as what's already been used in concrete for decades. And because it's been used in concrete for decades, it's been extensively studied. And they've taken the concrete, ground it up, tried to get stuff to leach out of it, and have determined that it's not a problem. So when you talk about recycling the concrete out of these lagoons, it's really the same process that's been tested and proven for decades, but it's making possible the cleanup of these sites by lowering the carbon content.
I thought the discussion about the municipal landfills was particularly chilling. And as a reporter, of course, I would love to see the manifest to know where the coal ash is going into what municipal landfills. Is there, short of calling every solid waste department in North Carolina, is there a database, or Lisa or Nick, do you know how to kind of get your head around that particular problem from a data point?
That's a good question, and because municipal solid waste landfills are operated under state laws on a state-by-state basis, I would think it would differ. I don't know how one would find out in the state where the ash is going. I mean, Duke has been helpful in announcing often where it's sending its ash, so we've been able to identify the recipient. But I'm not sure where one could go, either statewide or even nationally, for a database that would help you. So I'm sorry.
And I just want to add, since this was came up, at least for the Southern Environmental Law Center, for the agreements that we have been able to reach with utilities that require the excavation of these coal ash sites, we always make sure to include requirements for basically the industrial solid waste landfill standards be used for any site that's going to receive coal ash. So have adequate liners, groundwater monitoring, leachate collection, and all those protections.
A question about the recent issue with Hurricane Matthew and disaster preparedness and coal ash ponds. Given that with such massive flooding like we had, there may be kind of commingling of contaminants from multiple sources, basically all heading downstream. Can you comment on regulation and then either research considerations or policy considerations for large-scale natural disasters, especially given that reasonable expectations are that those will either continue or increase in their frequency?
Well, let me give you the national perspective, and Nick probably has something to add, and then I don't know if Pete has anything to add, who is actually the man on the spot out at HF Lee. It is a large problem, and EPA has considered that the ability of a coal ash dam to withstand a design storm, or what would be the largest storm that could occur, is absolutely essential. So again, I'll repeat myself, on November 16th of this year, you will see whether dams are complying with the flood, for a better word, I think they call it flood inflow. So the engineering standards have to be sufficient, different for high and significant and low hazard dams, but they have to withstand certain degrees of storms. These are sort of, pro forma dam requirements. Fortunately, now we'll see if the coal ash dams can be compliant with those. This doesn't answer the question, which is a really good one, of are our data outdated in terms of, what is the 100-year floodplain? What is the design storm, the worst storm that can occur in a particular area? And do we need to play catch-up on the federal level in order to increase the safety of these dams because the storms are larger or more frequent due to climate change? But I can tell you that at least for the statistics that other dams have to comply with in terms of how to withstand the added water from a storm and the rising river, those requirements are in effect. And it will be useful to look at, I think, what the utilities are going to post, because not every dam, at least in their annual inspections that were released last February, not every dam said that they could withstand the amount of water that would come from the storm and be able to, safely handle it. So whether we're going to get honest disclosures, I can't tell you, but those disclosures will come.
Just real quick, just a couple of points on that. One, I read an article recently, I think there have been 6 500-year floods in the United States in the last year. So this is really a major issue. The utilities don't like to think more than 30 years ahead. That's just the way they do things. So that's a big problem. That being said, right now in the Southeast, as a result of what we've achieved and everything that's happened, I think every coal ash site in the coastal plain is being excavated except one in Virginia that we're still fighting about. So that's a positive development. But for example, at Roxborough, there's a coal ash lagoon that's in a floodplain up there that they currently have no plans to excavate, that needs to be cleaned up. So this is a major consideration. The other point is this: when this information comes out about design storms and what these dams can withstand, it needs to be scrutinized very carefully, because the utilities or their consultants, it's very squalid. They cheat and they lie and they misrepresent things a lot. So for example, at 2 Duke Energy sites in South Carolina, we looked hard at the flood information and the dam safety information for those sites and found a host of very serious fundamental flaws in the studies that they'd done, where they claimed they could meet the design storm, but when you scrutinized it, it was clear that they had vastly overstated their ability to handle those things. When we directed the state agency to these problems, they basically took our concerns, sent them straight to the utility, and that was a direct driver of the cleanups that the utility eventually had to do with those 2 sites. So you cannot take for granted what these studies say.
Yes, I want to thank you all. I think this was a really important discussion, but I'm really concerned about the fact that people are taking the fact that decades worth of unlined coal ash dumps right next to rivers being excavated is a good solution without looking at what happens. First of all, moving it to landfills is moving it to environmental justice neighborhoods and communities that have already been impacted. And so you're taking it from a bad place and moving it to a low-income minority neighborhood that's already had to deal with landfills. And now they're getting coal ash and all of those issues. People seem very relieved that leachate systems are going to be in some of these new sites. But when you take leachate from coal ash, it's highly toxic, and it's going into wastewater treatments, which I believe Dr. Van Gosh has said are not equipped to handle the heavy metals or the radiation. And so then it either goes into the sludge or it goes directly back into the rivers. So the fact that there is a leachate system doesn't solve the problem. It just passes it to two different places, dumping it on top of fields where it's going to leach into the water again, or dumping it into the rivers. And in Chatham County, for example, their new lined landfill, lined with cheap plastic liners that have a 5-year warranty, they're permitted for 300,000 gallons of leachate per day. And that's going to the Sanford wastewater treatment, which I believe is not at all to handle that. So we have a chance to go from this terrible existing situation to something better. But this is a one-time chance, because we're not going to do it better and then have to deal with it again and again. We need to make this move as good as possible, because it's a one-time chance. People are aware of it. It's going from these bad places to better. And I wonder how much effort is going into ensuring that the second step, this new line landfill or new dump sites, are the best possible. And I really want to challenge the idea that because it's lined and because it has a leachate system, it's an improvement. Could somebody address that? And Dr. Van Gosh, could you address what happens with leachate in a typical wastewater treatment plant?
So, first of all, yeah, thank you for this great question. And I'll let you to struggle with it as well. But the way I would address it, taking one step back and see the lack of science in any of the decision-making, or many of the decision-making that we are experiencing. I mean, if you look back what's happened with the coal ash, with all the saga that just we heard about the hexavalent chromium and the to drink and no drink letters that we just heard, all of that reflecting the lack of engagement with the scientific community. And it's like two different entities kind of without interaction, without a dialogue, either coming from the state, sometimes it's coming from, of course, the industry have their own things, but I think the state would need and should have much more intensive scientific framework to understand what is the legacy of 50 years of coal ash pond in North Carolina and what does it mean to the environment, to water quality, to human health. This is lacking, and we are kind of in a vacuum of trying to doing ad hoc studies to trying to understand that. And then this is a really kind of a missing. Obviously, when you take leachate composed of heavy metals and put it in a domestic wastewater system that aims to remove organics as any domestic, sewage system, you don't take care of any of the inorganic constituents. This is a well-known, you don't need to be a high-level scientist to understand that. And the fact that they're still using just a common sewage, domestic sewage system to remove potential contaminants from leachate, from coal ash, without any independent oversight and without monitoring it, it should not be happening. Absolutely. And here's another example for the lack of any scientific oversight and monitoring that tell the state or the county what you should and should not do. So I totally agree with this kind of a problem. I think we know that the coal ash ponds are problematic, and either moving it into a dry landfill disposal, this is the correct and the right solution? I don't know. So that's perhaps you guys have a better answer for that.
This has been a long-running debate, but just a couple of points. First, it is not true that coal ash that's being cleaned up in North Carolina is being dumped on other low-income communities by and large. I mean, many of the sites that are being cleaned up are having modern lined landfills constructed actually on the site. That's happening at Dan River. It's happening at Sutton. In Asheville, the ash is being used at the airport to facilitate that excavation. So it's not the case that it's just dumping it on some other community. Second point is you have to think about where what the alternative is, and currently where the coal ash is stored is the worst possible places that you could imagine. These leaking pits. Frequently, they're already in low-income communities. If you think about Belews Creek, which we saw earlier, if you think about Sutton, where we had the Flemington community, and a lot of people, relying on subsistence fishing on Sutton Lake, and on and on. So, we have to take action. There is no perfect solution, but the modern industrial solid waste landfill standards are the best that we have. If there are problems with wastewater treatment of leachate in a municipal water system, that is an important problem, but it's sort of a separate problem, and it's one that needs to be tackled as well. But it doesn't mean that these sites shouldn't be cleaned up. So I'll leave it there.
Well, I'll just say that I think I believe that you've raised a legitimate and very important problem. Earthjustice is involved at the Uniontown, the Arrowhead landfill in Alabama, where we're opposing the renewal of the permit. We've brought a Title VI civil rights action on behalf of the community there, and we're looking, which I think will be the solution, to change the municipal solid waste landfill regs so that we don't have to chase after every landfill, as we have to do in Alabama. We're also considering a site in Georgia. It's going to be a problem until the law gets fixed. And then even after the law gets fixed, there has to be thoughtful transfer of waste. And it's going to involve the Clean Water Act, RCRA. This is a big problem, but I think that there is acknowledgement among the groups working on the issue that, that this is one of the prime issues, in the bundle of addressing coal ash pollution.
I'd like to hear maybe from, this has been a great presentation all morning from everyone. And Nick and Lisa have done a great job also with the work that they do on a daily basis and their presentations about policy issues and a lot of the quasi-political and other issues that have gone on across the state with the coal ash ponds. I'd be interested to hear from our other presenters this morning about their general feelings about some of these policy issues. Do you think that there are environmental issues going on around these coal ash ponds based upon some of the study that you've done and other things that you've read and heard? Do you think that the environmental justice issues that have been raised and that we've read about are valid concerns or not around these coal ash ponds? Would you buy a home within a half mile and live around one of these coal ash ponds that had a drinking water well or not? And how you might feel about it. I'd just like to hear maybe some of the ideas that you may have in your head about some of the policy issues that have been talked about and relating to your study and the things that you understand scientifically. And I believe, Dr. Vengas, you're exactly right. Much more scientific research needs to be produced and understood, but I'd like to hear from some of them about how they feel about some of the policy stuff.
Thank you for this question. It's really a practical outcome of most of the studies. So from my point of view, health studies, so that's like situation we have with all new factors of exposure. So tobacco was used initially as treatment also, and to treat some like cancer lesions of skin. So then many, many years passed, so we've got some information on health issues. Now we know that it's not only treatment, and mostly it's not treatment, but it's hazardous. So for coal ash, in terms of health impacts, we're just gathering information on health impacts because we need some exposure, especially for chronic diseases. And as earlier we discussed that it may take like 30, 40 years probably for Alzheimer's disease, for example, to develop under the toxic influence of certain contaminants. So that's why it's definitely what can we tell now about health issue. Yeah, there is something here. There is some potential impact on cognitive function as Alzheimer's disease. There is also some potential impacts on other diseases and organs. And it's definitely should move forward. We definitely need to include new data and new data sets, and we should compare different exposure times, different distances from exposure, so different rates of exposure. So all this stuff will provide with new information. Can, for example, from my point of view, can I now suggest very strict explanation for policy changes based on health impacts? Right now, we are on stage of like first stage of analysis. Right now we can tell, yes, that's not healthy, that's not good. The extent, the degree of this hazard, so that's what we need to identify, evaluate using additional data and gathering additional data.
Thank you for your question. The research I presented today is focusing on selenium, but in fact we sampled for the entire suite of constituents that we've heard about over and over again this morning. And the analysis of those constituents in these lake compartments is ongoing and will be released as soon as possible. So from my perspective, an area of potential concern is that not just selenium, which is mostly a fish health problem, but also other constituents which have a higher health potential for health risks will be stored in these lakes, and there's not, as far as I'm aware, a conversation occurring at the policy level about whether or not to remove any of the sediments that are harboring a lot of these contaminants from the lakes that they are currently existing in. So we're moving the ash, and we're not going to continue polluting some of these lakes or rivers, but the existing contamination will remain there.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit to actually environmental injustice. I was actually really happy to see that as part of the interest in looking at the coal ash regulations, because that's actually something we've seen, not just with coal, but across the different energy sections. That's something we've seen on the ground during our own sampling. So I actually think that's a really important issue that is actually happening, not just in specific cases, but across the whole country.
So certainly to answer your specific question, if you want to buy a house next to a coal ash pond, don't do that. If you have a well that could be a half a mile from a coal ash pond, be careful. That's obvious, and actually we can say very comfortably that we have very solid scientific evidence that coal ash effluent do reach to the hydrological system and do affect the water quality, surface water, shallow groundwater. This is already established. We don't need, there's no question about that. The only kind of the question that still remains, and that's what I said before, we are lacking baseline, we're lacking long-term scientific data to see how far and what is the extent of this contamination takes place through the numerous sites that we see people living next to coal ash pond or next to a landfill. So I think that could answer your specific question. I think I'm looking at the watch, it's at 12:04, and probably you want to eat and not hear about coal ash anymore. So we'll end up the session. I want to thank the speakers first. And those who are staying with us, I would like to invite you to join us for lunch. Lunch will be on the second floor. There will be people that will guide you to lunch. You can go either by stairs to the third floor or by elevator to the second floor. That's kind of the instruction that I had received. And thank you again for your attention today.